Ask is an artist known for the character illustrations of female characters from popular IPs, such as Fate Grand Order, Evangelion, as well as Surtur from Arknights, just to name a few, using saturated colors, dramatic lighting, and an exceptional eye for long flowing hair. They create vivid and visually striking images that one may find difficult to look away from, which is probably how they have amassed themselves a massive following of 680,000 followers on Twitter. Hello everyone, I am me. I'm an amateur artist who draws as a hobby. Having been recently inspired by videos made by Tipo and Noel, I have decided to make a quick summary video about the study I have done on one of Ask's pieces on the popular Arknights character Surtur. Do note that what I present in this video might not be the best practice, but rather just what worked for me and my experience. The objective of the study is to focus on the way hair and skin are rendered, which in my opinion, along with the slender stature of the way Ask draw the female characters, are really what makes the illustration stand out. To start, I began with a quick sketch using a default flat marker brush. Any hard edge brush will work, but on screen are the settings of the brush that I am using. Feel free to pause the video and copy the settings. Here is also a demo of the brush for reference. The sketching phase is pretty straightforward. Break up the scary looking blank canvas with loose lines and slowly refine it as you go along. I had to zoom in here as I have a tendency to sketch at a smaller scale in order to keep my brush strokes thick. Thin lines personally pressure me into getting precise and clean lines, which really hurt the efficiency of the sketching phase. If you ever feel like something is off but not sure, check the relative proportions of the different parts against one another. For example, how wide are the shoulders compared to the size of the head? Another good practice is to lay down rough guides, as it is easy to get lost when you get into the thick of sketching. Moving on to the line art phase, I chose to use a G pen with the following settings as well as a vector layer for ease of cleanup of overlapping lines. As you will see in the recording, I have chose to skip over some line art to save time, since I know the different parts will be separated visually by the colors later. For the coloring, I started off by blocking in the base colors on their own separate layers using the lasso fill and paint bucket tool. In general, my layer structure follows the rules of, if it's a different color, use a different layer. This also applies to layers used to add shadows, highlights, or gradients. However, if I'm sure about the colors I'm using, as is this case here with a perfect reference, I will instead lock the pixels and airbrush it in directly. Here are the airbrush settings. Since the hair is probably the most complicated part of this study, this is how I have split the layers for the details. I have added another gradient layer for adjustments, one shadow/detail layer, and two highlight layers, one to increase the brightness and another to give it more color like the original. Finally, on top of all the line art is another detail layer for all the strands of hair that overlap the original line art. For the shadows, I am mainly using the G pen to block out the darker parts in. Unlike the rest of the body, there wasn't really a need to blend any colors here, so the G pen was more than enough. For the back of the head, I see that there's a little bit of light there, so using the shadow layer, I blocked out the parts that are darker and reused the gradient layer underneath to cast some light there. Finally, I added another layer at the very bottom for the hair on the other side for convenience. Moving on to the body and skin, I once again blocked in colors using the G pen and the lasso fill tool on a new clip layer. This time, blending is required and the brush I'm using for it is the smooth watercolor brush. Once the initial blocking is complete, some blending is done, and using the same layer, I locked the pixels again and I brushed in some darker tones to get more color variation in. The same process is repeated for the dress and accessories. I tried to replicate what appears to be some kind of rough gold material on the dress, but eventually chose to skip it as I could not replicate the textures reliably. For the arm accessory, I used the border layer effect to have the outlines added in directly. Note that you have to rasterize the layer first if you want to paint over the outline directly onto that layer. Zooming in on the eyes, I used the G pen again to add in the details as well as an outer ring of brighter pink/purple before using the watercolor brush to blur the outlines a little. The watercolor brush is also used to blur the white part of the eyes, so the transition between the eye and skin isn't as harsh. At this point, the study is basically complete, and I'm just adding in some missed details here and there as I spot them. The highlights of the hair were first added by drawing with a G pen in white, then using the watercolor brush to just ever so slightly blur out the bottom. I brush upwards into the highlight, so the color trail that the brush tends to leave behind goes into the highlight instead of leaving a mess had I have brushed downwards. I then duplicated the layer and added some colors and played around with the layer modes to try to replicate what I had observed in the reference. In the end, I didn't use any layer modes but just turned down the opacity of the white layer on top. At the end here, I also basically glossed over the horns as I felt like I've achieved my initial objective of replicating the hair and skin well enough. And that's the end of the study. Here's a quick comparison with the original again. Up until this point, I have yet to place the pictures side by side, so I could see how well I could spot any differences by eye. Looking at it now, I can clearly see some differences around the nose and face compared to the original. Also, the eyes in the original piece feels much more refined. However, the reference image did not have enough resolution for me to zoom in and see clearly, so I'm more than satisfied with what I've got. For the hair, I really like what I've accomplished. However, without fully understanding the forms of the hair, I doubt I could replicate Ask's rendering well enough should the character change the hairstyle. Another thing that never ceases to impress me is how quickly highlights can change your perception of the material. Ask's style of rendering hair can be considered on the more simplistic side compared to some other artists, but a few highlights in the otherwise low detailed areas really pop the image out. Finally, for the body and skin, there isn't much complexity, so it wasn't difficult to get close to the original. However, I have noticed that I've missed a slight gradient on the base color of the skin. In general, there's always some gradient even on seemingly similarly colored areas, so you should always keep an eye out for those. Here's one last look at the different stages of completion. Also for reference, the study itself took me the better part of the day to complete. As the video draws to a close, I just want to say that, having always been on the receiving side of tutorials and guides, I hope this video has been helpful to someone out there as well. Also, this is my first YouTube video, so let me know in the comments down below how I've done, if it had been useful or too fast, or if there was something specific that you wish I had added. I hope to put out more videos similar to this one, and perhaps more beginner-friendly ones that will guide you along with some of the rendering as well. If that is something you might be interested in, consider giving the channel a subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.